Central London in the late 1940s. A man in late middle age, military bearing, neat moustache, hair balding under his bowler hat, arrives at the building opposite me here on Whitehall. Today it belongs to the Cabinet Office, but back then this was a bank, Holt's, a discreet, exclusive establishment for military gentlemen. You can still see the name carved in stone over the door. Inside, the man gives his name as Captain Theo Spencer and withdraws money from one of his accounts. He emerges and sets off back down Whitehall, through Parliament Square, to his office at 54 Broadway. But his name isn't really Captain Theo Spencer at all.
The Sudanese army overthrew democracy and seized power.
Syrians are certain that the West won't help them and that Russia is their friend.
So who was this man? And what has this unremarkable journey to the bank got to do with political turmoil and secret operations in Egypt and Syria and Sudan? The answers are revealed in an extraordinary document recently discovered in the National Archives by Dr. Rory Cormack of the University of Nottingham.
I was rummaging through thousands and thousands of files to try and uncover some interesting MI6 material, which of course is very secret and very classified. And I stumbled upon this one evening in the National Archives, and it's one of those documents where your heart starts to go a little bit faster because you start seeing references to C, the chief of MI6, to special operations that I'd never even heard of before.
We've got the document here in front of us, and it's a note for record. What was happening and where?
It's a note from a meeting written up by Edward Bridges, who was the senior official in the Treasury. There are four characters. There's Bridges from the Treasury. There is William Strang, who was the senior official at the Foreign Office and a man who loved everything to be in order. And then they're the two chiefs of MI6, the outgoing chief of MI6, Stewart Menzies, and his successor, John Sinclair.
The man in the bowler hat, it turns out, was Sir Stewart Menzies.
And he drops a bombshell of an inheritance. He confesses to Strang and to Bridges that he, MI6, has a top secret unofficial fund, which, for want of a better word, is a slush fund.
So no one knew about this money beforehand? I mean, no one outside of MI6?
The document definitely suggests that nobody outside of MI6 had any idea about this. The politicians didn't know. Even MI6's financial director didn't know.
Even though a select handful of people were now being told about the chief of MI6's unofficial fund, it was still top secret. So how did this very sensitive document come to be made public now? I asked Jill Bennett, former chief historian at the Foreign Office, who was involved in its release.
This particular record comes from a set of documents called the Cabinet Secretary's Secret and Personal Archive, which was only really avowed when the first documents were released in 2013. And I had been asked by a previous Cabinet Secretary, Gus O'Donnell, now Lord O'Donnell, because they had all these documents in the basement of number 70, Whitehall, that had been piling up, and they were all the documents that successive cabinet secretaries over the years had put in the too difficult, too sensitive, don't know what to do with it, drop it in a deep hole crowd. But this deep hole had filled up. And he said, we can't keep all this stuff, so I'd like somebody to look at it. And so for about 8 years, on and off, I worked on this archive and read through them all, work out who needed to see them from the intelligence agencies to make sure you could release them.
In 1945, MI6, officially known as the Secret Intelligence Service, or SIS, had the job of spying and carrying out covert action abroad, supposedly always under the political control of the Foreign Secretary. It was funded by what's called a secret vote by Parliament, and it had an official reserve of unspent money. But this newly revealed secret fund, what was called the unofficial reserve, was something quite different. Our document suggests that at the meeting in June 1952, the head of the Treasury, Edward Bridges, was concerned that MI6 chief Stewart Menzies, known as C, was being rather evasive about the fund.
If, however, the reserves were of a very large amount, then the use of such unofficial reserves by C, without the prior consent of the Foreign Office, could enable him to carry out policies other than those approved by the Foreign Office and without their knowledge.
C then disclosed that the total of these reserves was approximately £800,000.
It looks like C is then pressed by William Strang of the Foreign Office as to why he had this unofficial reserve and what's it for.
Well, C responds by saying that
He thought it right to have a large sum to meet such contingencies as A. A very large inducement to some person in an absolutely key position.
for inducement, should we read bribery?
I mean, given this fund he's revealing is £800,000 in early 1950s money, which is millions and millions of pounds now, I mean, that's quite a significant bribe if you were to offer it to someone, isn't it?
Certainly is a very large inducement.
Or B, the vote for the service being drastically cut in some political emergency, in a way which would make it impossible to carry on the service in the way it was necessary.
The second reason, the vote for the service being drastically cut in some political emergency.
There's always a fear when you move from war to peace that the budgets for the military, for intelligence, are going to be vulnerable.
But in another memo in the same file from about a year later, it transpires that Menzies had been a little off. The total of the unofficial reserve held in that bank account wasn't £800,000 at all. It was actually nearly double, £1.4 million, by one estimate more than £39 million today. We showed the files to historian Stephen Dorrell, author of MI6's 50 Years of Special Operations.
I think these files are very interesting indeed. They are most unusual because obviously we don't get to see MI6 files still. There are very, very few original MI6 files and you have to dig around in other departments to see material. What makes this of interest is it's about money, about budgets. And it's very rare to see this kind of material, particularly about British intelligence, because it tells you a great deal about how the service operates, what kind of operations they are doing and at what kind of level. So I think these are really important documents.
For a year, the heads of the Treasury here in front of me and the Foreign Office over on the other side of King Charles Street didn't tell a single politician about this money. And when they finally did, they only told one. In June 1953, they let the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rab Butler, in on the secret.
This time last year, the then head of the Secret Service retired. In connection with his retirement, we tidied up and regularized the position of certain reserves available for the secret vote. The position is now on a satisfactory basis. But as the reserves are considerable, it would be right that you, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, should be aware of their existence.
But behind this extraordinary situation, there remains a mystery. Just how did MI6 Chief Stewart Menzies get hold of such a vast sum of money?
As part of his confession, Menzies gives a very vague account of where it might have come from.
Rory Cormack.
He says it had been subscribed by well-wishers of the service and included a particularly large sum from an American. And we don't know what percentage of the slush funds came from one individual, but if he's being singled out as a particularly large donor, one would assume that it's a substantial proportion. And there aren't that many people in America at the time who would be able to give that much money.
So it's the equivalent today of someone giving tens of millions of dollars secretly to fund covert operations and to help support a foreign intelligence agency.
Throughout the entire collection of documents, the well-wisher is never named, but we get a sense that it comes towards the end of the war.
What do we know about the actual account itself?
Well, the document does give a name. It says that the account is held in the name of Theo Spencer, but then it says that this is a non-existent character.
We have only a few clues about the source of the money. There's that name on the account, Theo Spencer. The documents say it's fictitious, but digging around online reveals there was a real Theodore Spencer at Harvard University in Boston in the 1940s, who seems tantalisingly plausible. He was an English literature professor and an Anglophile. He'd studied at Cambridge University between the wars. Could he have been the donor? A few years ago, his wartime diaries were donated to Princeton University. Do they hold any clues as to whether he could have made such an extraordinary gift?
I figured for income tax purposes that I made $1,165.51 last year from writing and lecturing. By the end of this month, I will have made $645.85 this year. But I won't be able to keep that up. 2 unexpected windfalls account for it.
So it seems doubtful Theodore Spencer himself made the gift. But a university magazine interview with his late son does say he had interesting connections to writers Robert Sherwood, Archibald MacLeish, Dorothy Thompson, all linked to something called British Security Coordination, or BSC. BSC was a secret outfit set up in 1940 with the authorization of Winston Churchill to draw America into the war, and it was closely connected to MI6. BSC was based in the Rockefeller Center in New York, courtesy of Nelson Rockefeller, a man who certainly had enough money to give millions of dollars to the British, and who ran wartime US intelligence operations in Latin America as coordinator for inter-American affairs. A scholarly article from 1981 in the Journal of Contemporary History by one of his agents, a man called Paul Kramer, carries a striking revelation.
At this point, one should perhaps refer to the coordinator's secret fund. It was never significant, roughly $50,000 a year, although it is true that the coordinator's office was one of the very few U.S. government agencies before Pearl Harbor to have such a fund.
And then there's Nelson's brother David, also heavily involved in America's wartime intelligence efforts. Inquiries with the family reveal that David was taught by Theodore Spencer at Harvard in the 1930s. In 1959, Spencer's son, John, married David and Nelson's niece. This is all very tempting, but not conclusive. I need to try something else. I'm on my way to meet a novelist and former diplomat with a close knowledge of the intelligence field. I asked him about the name Theo Spencer, and he suggested we meet here, back near the old Holt's Bank building on Whitehall, where the Spencer account was kept.
Well, Mansfield Cumming founded MI6, as we call it, Secret Intelligence Service, in 1909. He had a number of offices in London until the start of the First World War, when he came here to Whitehall Court.
This is Alan Judd, the author of The Quest for C, a biography of MI6's first chief.
Exclusive flats. It still is, large part of it.
What evidence is there that he might have used this name, Theo Spencer?
It is known that he rented his first office and flat here in this building in the name of Spencer, Captain Spencer. He also is buried in Bursledon churchyard near Southampton, and there's a grave next to his, or very nearby, which is that of a Captain Spencer Smith, who also lived in Bursledon, whom Cumming would certainly have known. He'd lived there many years. It's a very small place. And Smith was one of Cumming's born name. He was Smith Cumming.
So he seems to have used this as a code name, effectively, and maybe picked it up from someone he knew.
Not so much a code name, but just a useful alias, because he didn't want his own name to be associated with MI6 in this building.
And so do you think it's possible he set up a bank account then in that name?
It's quite possible. He had the kind of contacts that he could do that very easily, particularly with Rothschilds. He was very close to them, saw a lot of them. He could easily have got them to fix it with the bank for him.
Do you think it's possible then that this account could have been passed on to his successors if such an account had existed using that name?
It's very likely everything else was passed on to his successor, Admiral Sinclair. That kind of contact, that kind of procedure would have just been what he'd done. And Sinclair then would have passed it on to Menzies in the Second World War, and so Menzies probably used it.
So that explains Captain Theo Spencer. But it still leaves the mysterious, unnamed American donor. The real Theodore Spencer, the Harvard academic, may not have been the source, but the trail he led us down of rich, pro-British sophisticates based in New York, Washington and New England remains the most promising line of inquiry. I asked Stephen Dorrell, having looked through the files, who he thought the donor could be.
My own speculation would probably be Vincent Astor, who started The Room in the United States in the 1930s, which was very sympathetic towards the British and discussed intelligence matters. Astor had the money. He was very Anglophile. He brought together a group of businessmen, people in politics, etc., who were pro-British. This became an important group in terms of bringing the British into America and setting up intelligence with the British Security Coordination in New York. And Astor was one of the key people. He knew people like Claude Dancy, who was the vice chief of MI6, that if it went through somebody else's conduit, then the other person is probably Donovan of the OSS.
And that leads us here, to an elegant townhouse on Grosvenor Street in Mayfair. This was the London headquarters of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime spy agency forerunner of the CIA, set up and led by William Donovan. In 1945, as the war came to a close, Donovan was based in London, and he and his men were looking apprehensively to the future.
Donovan was a Wall Street lawyer before he became chief of the OSS and had connections with the Room, the aristocratic US intelligence circle gathered around Vincent Astor.
Professor Hugh Wilford is the author of America's Great Game.
The relationship between US and British intelligence at that point was very good. They'd just obviously been allies in World War II, and there'd been a lot of cooperation between the two services. There are a lot of wealthy people in the Office of Strategic Services, corporate lawyers, people with family money. They're people who have grown up in quite sort of aristocratic families, gone to New England prep schools, the Ivy League universities. They admired Britain. Perhaps an American had already seen the Cold War coming, decided that the British were deserving beneficiaries of some American charity, I guess you could call it.
I suppose OSS was being wound up and it wasn't quite clear what was going to come next because the CIA only came a few years later. And so I suppose it's possible in that end of war period that people thought, well, we're not quite sure what we'll be doing next, but the Brits are going to keep going, so let's fund them a bit.
Exactly. I can only really suppose that something exactly like that occurred. You know, everything was being wound up quite hurriedly. There was money in various pots dotted around. A lot of this was sort of being controlled really by a few individuals. Perhaps one of those thought that this was a good way to spend this money before any accountants hoovered it up.
Do you think it could literally have been some money left over from OSS in London and it was a way of passing it on, and because it's already there and it doesn't have to be transferred, perhaps?
That's a possibility, yes.
Jill Bennett, former chief historian at the Foreign Office, also thinks that some of those Americans who worked with Britain might have offered the money.
Maybe somebody gave Menzies some money as a thank you for all the help he gave.
But she also sounds a note of caution about Menzies' story about an unnamed American.
To some extent, he would say that, wouldn't he? I'm not saying there weren't wealthy well-wishers, but it may be money he'd acquired during operations during the war. I mean, I don't know.
It may be impossible to say for certain who the quiet American behind the money was, but its existence still begs a question. What was done with this money? The files show that in the 6 years after the civil servants found out about the unofficial reserve, only a few £1,000s were being withdrawn each year. But as Rory Cormack showed me, the papers also say MI6's reserves, the largest part of which came from the mysterious donations, were vital in allowing it to carry out secret operations.
It says they were really crucial when adoption by the government of a number of proposals for special political activity which could not have been financed if there had been no reserves to draw on.
So in a sense, having that unofficial reserve gives them the freedom, the latitude to feel confident they can go out and do all kinds of covert actions because they know they've got that money in their back pocket, effectively.
That's it. And there was a massive drive for more British covert action around this time.
By the mid-1950s, the West and the Communist bloc were entrenched in the Cold War. One region British Prime Minister Anthony Eden was deeply concerned about was the Middle East. He feared the hostile influence of Egypt's new Arab nationalist President Nasser and the spread of Soviet power.
Anthony Eden wrote another staggering document where he's calling for more offensive counter-subversion measures, as he puts it, covert ones, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia and in the colonies. So this is a time when covert action was really on the agenda, and this fund, even if not all of it was spent on covert action, enabled the MI6 to spend their regular money on a range of operations.
What's unusual here is in these files about the money, there's names of actual secret operations.
Yeah, this is wonderful. You do not often see in the British National Archives reference to top secret MI6 operations with their code names. And not only does it list them, it then tells you how much money Britain actually spent on these various operations.
So here we can see Scant, £60,000, Scream, £50,000, Sawdust, £200,000.
There's a lot of money.
What do we know about these operations?
Some of them very little. We know Scant involved covert propaganda to try and target NASA, to undermine him. Scream, we think, involved shoring up the pro-Western Lebanese Prime Minister, through propaganda. Propaganda formed the backbone of all of Britain's activities, covert activities in the Middle East. Sawdust, at a staggering cost of $200,000, we think encompassed numerous operations to bring down NASA. Predating Suez, so from about 55 onwards, this is discussions with rebels to form shadow governments, this kind of thing. Straggle involved trying to overthrow the Syrian government, and Khartoum, nobody knows.
So there's still a mystery around that.
There's still a mystery.
Let's take a look at one of those countries targeted by covert operations, Syria.
The Americans and all the allies who cooperate with America are describing Syria to be communist, but they are quite mistaken.
In 1954, a government took power in Syria, which, as far as Britain was concerned, was worryingly left-wing. So Straggle was concocted, a plan to overthrow the Damascus government. The British brought in the Americans to help, but in the end the operation fell apart. And yet our document, as well as American papers, suggest this was not the end of attempts to intervene.
As early as March 1957, attention returned to Syria. The Americans knew that Britain were very keen to overthrow the Syrian government, and they came up with a top secret plan, which followed a kind of similar line to Straggle. It involved using subversion, propaganda and bribery to whip up unrest inside Syria, and then to have border trouble between either Syria and Iraq or Syria and Jordan, which would then force an intervention. It was even more risky and controversial than Straggle, though, because there were two extra elements. The first was they were going to fake Syrian attacks inside Iraq and Jordan to make Syria take the blame for things they didn't actually do, which is just sow the seeds for a war. Very risky and dangerous. The other thing they were thinking of doing seems to have been assassination. We see reference to certain individuals, which the document even names, having to be eliminated.
In the end, this second attempt collapsed as well. But wait a moment. This extremely aggressive, high-risk operation was planned and almost executed in 1957.
But an uneasy stillness lay over the Suez Canal zone. The ceasefire was in effect.
I deny emphatically the allegation that Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom...
That's after Britain's botched invasion of Egypt in October 1956 to try to recapture the Suez Canal, newly nationalised by Egypt's President Nasser. Wasn't Suez the moment when Britain finally had to accept that its imperial pretensions were over and it could no longer intervene aggressively as it had in the past? Stephen Dorrell.
There had been an idea that Suez had kind of dealt a major blow to Britain and MI6, but actually they came back and they used this as an excuse to launch a whole series of operations. These are covert operations. There are three that are to do with Sudan, Skion, Eleron and Al-Azmar. Against the latter one is a pencil writing, it says Mahdi, which was the leader in Sudan and was very pro-British, and it appears at a time when there's a general election in Sudan, and then in 58 there is a military coup. So these kind of fit, and there's Tudor, which is Oman, Razzle, which is Yemen. So if you add all these up, what you discover is a big increase in the number of special operations post-Suez.
MI6 during the mid-1950s, I think it's no exaggeration to say we're trying to redraw the entire landscape of the Middle East. This is an attempt to maintain British influence in an underhand way, to try and maintain Britain's position. And Suez clearly changed nothing. In fact, you could argue that after Suez, Britain's overt hand was even more constrained. So they relied on covert action to an even greater extent.
In 1956, the year of Suez, MI6 had a new chief. Dick White, a former head of MI5, is often seen as a more rigorous, by-the-book kind of leader. It was under him that the unofficial reserve was finally absorbed into a single, more normal account. But had the buccaneering spirit really departed? The same documents which detail the financial regularisation also show that aggressive covert action was still very much on the agenda.
And this is why these documents, I think, are not only fascinating, but really important, because they challenge this orthodox view that Dick White, the schoolmaster, comes in, clamps down on covert operations. What these documents suggest is that actually we see more covert operations under Dick White
after Suez
than were going on before him. What he does do, maybe true to character, is he tries to regularise them. So we see more, not fewer, operations just becoming more almost mainstream part of foreign policy.
So does our document show a rogue agency finally being brought to heel by Whitehall? Not quite. It does show MI6 fessing up to the secret money from mysterious well-wishers and putting it under Treasury supervision. But it also shows that for a few more years at least, the appetite for aggressive covert action was, if anything, increasing, and with the blessing of officials and very senior ministers. And this activity has left a lasting and sometimes problematic legacy for the region. Today, MI6, based here at Vauxhall, says it operates under the law and under careful political and financial controls. But if you happen to be in a bank and hear a man in front of you asked to make a large withdrawal in the name of a Captain Theo Spencer, then do let me know.